At midnight on August 22nd, 2026, something happened at the border between the United States and Canada that had never happened before in the history of either country. A 50% tariff, invoked under a section of American trade law that had sat unused since 1930, went into effect on billions of dollars of Canadian goods. Steel, aluminum, dairy, lumber, cars, whiskey, maple syrup, all of it, suddenly. Twice as expensive to bring across a border that for 80 years had been treated as the most frictionless in the world. And in Washington, in the days that followed, something else happened that mattered just as much. The people who normally stand beside a Republican president when he talks about trade, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, the Business Roundtable, farm groups, distillers, auto manufacturers, started standing against him instead. This is the story of how a trade war that Washington expected to win started to turn, and how a strategy built quietly in Ottawa over the last year and a half is now being credited by American business leaders themselves with reshaping the fight. Let's start with what actually happened, because the sequence matters. For most of 2025, President Donald Trump had already been reshaping American trade policy around tariffs, a 25% duty on foreign steel and aluminum imposed in early 2025, tariffs on Canadian lumber, repeated threats of broader measures tied to what the White House described as unfair treatment of American goods. Canada, under Prime Minister Mark Carney, responded early with retaliatory measures of its own, and something less visible but arguably more consequential began building alongside the government-to-government fight, an organic, consumer-driven boycott of American products inside Canada. According to Reuters and CBC News reporting through 2025, polling from the Angus Reid Institute found that a majority of Canadians said they had already changed, or intended to change, their buying habits to avoid American goods. That boycott would go on to matter far more than almost anyone in Washington initially expected. By the summer of 2026, the temperature had risen sharply. Negotiators from both countries spent the week of August 17th in what CNN and PBS NewsHour both described as intensive last-ditch talks aimed at avoiding a fresh round of tariffs. According to reporting from Global News, citing an interview U.S. Trade Representative Jameson Greer gave to the New York Times, the American side had actually offered meaningful concessions. A reduction in tariffs on steel, aluminum, and autos, and the elimination of a recently imposed tariff on Canadian lumber. Those measures, Greer said, would have given Canada more preferential treatment than any other American trading partner. For a few days, there was real hope in both capitals that a deal was close. Then, late on the night of Friday, August 21st, the talks collapsed. NBC News reported the breakdown happened suddenly, after a week in which negotiators on both sides had appeared cautiously optimistic. By the following morning, the 50% tariffs Trump had first threatened back in July were no longer a threat. They were law. PBS News reported that the tariffs were imposed under Section 338 of the Tariff Act of 1930, a provision so old and so rarely invoked that, according to PBS, it had never actually been used before in the history of American trade policy. Unlike the more familiar Section 232 national security tariffs Trump had used on steel and aluminum, Section 338 carries no built-in expiration date and applies even to goods that are fully compliant with the U.S.-Mexico-Canada trade agreement, known as USMCA or CUSMA. Carney, speaking Saturday morning after the tariffs took effect, called the American move a miscalculation. Over the weekend, according to NBC News, he went further, describing Canada as being at war with the United States over trade. Striking language from a prime minister generally seen as a cautious, technocratic figure, a former central banker not known for inflammatory rhetoric. Trump, for his part, was not cautious at all. In a series of posts on his social media platform Truth Social, quoted directly by CNN and Newsweek, Trump wrote, "I deal with many countries, and Canada is easily the most difficult and unreasonable." He went on, "They feel entitled, but they are not a state, and will be entitled no longer." On Monday, August 24th, he escalated further, threatening to double tariffs on Canadian cars, trucks, auto parts, and steel to 50% starting January 1st, 2027. "Canada has been ripping off the United States of America for years," he wrote, "not sustainable and will no longer be tolerated." In another post, reported by CNBC, Trump floated renaming Lake Ontario to Lake America and suggested halting business with the province of Ontario altogether. On trade, and in other ways, also, they are among the worst nations in the world to deal with, he wrote. "We don't need Canada, they need us." It's worth pausing here to separate fact from framing, because that's exactly the kind of distinction that gets lost in a fast-moving trade war. Trump's posts repeatedly cited a U.S. trade deficit with Canada as evidence of being taken advantage of. But CNBC's own reporting on the dispute noted that the imbalance Trump points to is driven overwhelmingly by one thing: the The United States buying enormous volumes of Canadian crude oil, a purchase that benefits American refiners and consumers directly. That's a real number, but the framing of it as Canada ripping off the U.S. is a characterization, not an independently verified fact. And it's one that trade economists dispute. Where the numbers are firm, we'll say so. Where they're contested, we'll say that too. Canada's response came on August 25th. According to Newsweek and the Canadian Federation of Independent Business, Ottawa unveiled a retaliatory package covering more than 700 separate categories of American goods, worth an estimated $20 billion, with duties ranging as high as 50% on some items. Carney said the new tariffs would take effect September 8th, structured, in his words, to match the American measures dollar for dollar. The retaliatory list is broad by design, hitting everything from beer to building materials to jewelry to farm products, a deliberate strategy to spread the political pain across as many American states and industries as possible, rather than concentrating it in a way that would let Washington absorb it quietly. And that is where this story turns from a government-to-government trade dispute into something Washington did not fully anticipate, a fight it is now losing inside its own political and business coalition. Start with the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, an organization that is, by long tradition, one of the most reliably pro-Republican, pro-business lobbying forces in Washington. On August 18th, just days before the talks collapsed, Neil Harrington, the Chamber's senior vice president for the Americas, issued a statement that read less like caution and more like a warning shot. The introduction of higher tariffs would damage both economies, drive up costs for U.S. families, further disrupt critical supply chains, and risk the 13 million American jobs that depend on trade under the U.S.-Mexico-Canada trade agreement, Harrington said. That 13 million job figure is the Chamber's own estimate. It should be treated as an advocacy number rather than an official government statistic, but it reflects how seriously the country's largest business lobbying group views the stakes. The Chamber did not stop at statements. According to Canadian outlet National Post, in earlier rounds of this same trade fight, the Chamber released a full state-by-state breakdown quantifying the economic damage tariffs and retaliation would inflict, an unusually aggressive and public break from a Republican administration by a group that has spent decades as one of the party's closest allies. Reuters, cited in that same reporting, described the Chamber's move as effectively accusing the White House of risking a global trade war in the name of protecting American industry. The Chamber was not alone. NPR's Scott Horsley reported that over the same weekend, the 50% tariffs took effect. Both the U.S. Chamber of Commerce and the Business Roundtable, the association representing chief executives of many of America's largest corporations, issued statements calling on Washington and Ottawa to return to the bargaining table. The Business Roundtable's statement was direct. New tariffs and retaliation risk raising costs for American businesses and families, disrupting vital supply chains, and straining the important economic relationship between the United States and Canada. We urge both governments to return to the negotiating table, remove harmful tariffs, and secure a path to preserve and strengthen USMCA. That is corporate lobby language for something blunter. Two of the most powerful business organizations in the country, historically aligned with the party currently in the White House, publicly telling that White House it has miscalculated. Politically, the pressure is not abstract. It maps directly onto next year's midterm elections. Newsweek's Alexandra Wood, in reporting on the dispute, noted what she called striking political geography. The states most economically exposed to a prolonged Canada trade war, Michigan, Maine, Ohio, Alaska, and Iowa, are also expected to be among the most competitive battlegrounds in the 2026 midterms. That is not a coincidence Washington strategists are ignoring. Michigan Republican Representative Lisa McClain defended the president to Fox News, saying, "What President Trump is trying to do, and I applaud him for that, is level the playing field. There is absolutely no way that President Trump is going to make a bad deal for the American people." But Maine's Susan Collins, a Republican senator facing a closely watched re-election battle, broke ranks entirely. Imposing new tariffs on Canada is a mistake, she told reporters, 5 words that, from a sitting Republican senator in a swing state, carry considerably more political weight than a press release from a trade association. Now, let's talk about where the American business complaints are actually coming from on the ground, because the abstract lobbying language only tells part of the story. The most visible, easiest to measure damage has landed on the American spirits industry. And it did not start with the events of this August. It started more than a year earlier, when Canadian provinces began pulling American liquor off store shelves in direct response to Trump's initial tariffs and his repeated suggestions that Canada should become the 51st American state. According to the Distilled Spirits Council of the United States, known as DISCUS, U.S. spirits exports to Canada collapsed by 85% in the second quarter of 2025 alone. The Wine Institute separately reported a 91% drop in U.S. wine exports to Canada over a 3-month stretch from March to July of that year, compared with the same period a year earlier. These are trade association figures drawn from industry reporting rather than a single unified government data set. But multiple independent outlets, CNN, CBC, and Wine Enthusiast among them, cite the same underlying Discus and Wine Institute numbers, which lends them real credibility even as we flag their source. The human cost of those numbers became concrete in December 2025, when Jim Beam, one of the most recognizable names in American bourbon, announced it was halting production at its main distillery in Kentucky. CBC News reported the halt came directly amid what it called the severe dip in exports tied to Canada's boycott. Canada had been, for decades, one of the largest export markets for American bourbon and whiskey, a market that, almost overnight, evaporated. The Globe and Mail's reporting on the boycott spread quoted Victor Yarbrough, co-founder of Bro Brothers, Kentucky's first black-owned distillery, describing his company as deeply disappointed after losing a lucrative supply deal with New Brunswick's provincial liquor authority, a deal Yarbrough said had been projected to boost the company's sales by more than 2.5% in a single year. That is not a Wall Street headline. That is a small American business in Louisville losing real revenue because of a trade fight fought almost entirely by politicians 1,000 miles away. Catherine Prather, president of the Kentucky-based National Tour Association, told the Globe and Mail the drop-off in Canadian group bookings for American tours has been, in her words, astronomical. One member tour operator, she said, reported just 2 bookings for U.S. tours in a recent 2-week stretch, compared to 39 bookings during the same period the year before. That is a 95% collapse in bookings for a single operator. An anecdote, not a national statistic, but one consistent with the broader travel data. The U.S. Travel Association's own report, cited by CBC News, forecast a full-year decline of 3.2% in international tourism spending across the entire United States for 2025, a loss of $5.7 billion, and attributed the bulk of that drop specifically to a fall-off in Canadian visitors. That matters because Canadians have traditionally made up the single largest group of international visitors to the United States, historically around 28% of all foreign tourism, according to the same reporting. When a group that large pulls back even modestly, the dollar impact is enormous. Some American states and cities have noticed enough to respond directly. According to Wikipedia's aggregated sourcing of contemporaneous news coverage, the state of California launched its own tourism campaign specifically aimed at winning back Canadian visitors. And the city of Palm Springs put up signage reading, "Palm Springs loves Canada," after its mayor, Rhonda Hart, noted that Canadian tourists spend an estimated $300 million a year in that region alone. Some American tour operators have reportedly begun offering exclusive discounted deals specifically targeted at Canadian travelers, trying to lure back a customer base that, for the first time in generations, has real, organized reasons to stay home. Meanwhile, on the Canadian side of the ledger, the picture business groups describe as almost the mirror image. Pain that is real, but is being spun by some into an argument for staying the course. The Canadian Chamber of Commerce's president and chief executive, Candice Lang, did not mince words after the August 22nd tariffs took effect, calling them a body blow to North American competitiveness in this self-defeating trade saga. She went further in a public statement. A whopping, non-absorbable tariff is not sustainable or viable for business. For a small Canadian exporter operating on tight margins, this isn't an abstract trade dispute. It means looking at your orders, your payroll, and your employees and asking what you can still afford. Americans will see their costs go up, and Canadians will see customers, investment, and small businesses disappear. That statement is worth including here in full because it complicates any simple narrative of Canada winning. Lang's own chamber is warning that this fight is costing Canadian jobs and Canadian small businesses too. This is not a story where one side is unscathed. And yet, alongside that pain, there is also documented evidence of a domestic Canadian economy adapting and, in some specific sectors, benefiting. Quebec's provincial liquor distributor, the SAQ, reported in its most recent annual report a 69.4% increase in sales of its Origine Quebec line of domestically produced spirits, a category built specifically to capture consumers switching away from American brands. CNN's reporting from Quebec quoted Paul Goulet, head of the province's Micro Distilleries Union, describing what he called an unprecedented sense of unity across Canada as a result of the trade war, and arguing that the disruption may prove constructive by pushing Canada to diversify its economic partnerships away from reliance on the United States. Canadian whiskey expert Davin de Kergamo, author of a widely cited book on the subject, told CBC News that bartenders and consumers who switch to Canadian rye out of necessity are, in many cases, staying with it by choice, building brand loyalty that, he suggested, may outlast the trade dispute itself. At a hotel bar in Quebec City, CNN reported, the head mixologist described swapping out American ryes like Sazerac and Templeton for Canadian brands like Lot 40 and simply keeping it that way. This is the piece of the puzzle that gives the title of this story its edge, and it's worth being precise about what Canada's strategy actually consists of, because it isn't one single policy. It's three things happening at once. First, the government-level retaliation. Dollar-for-dollar tariffs, deliberately broad in scope, designed to touch politically sensitive American industries and states rather than concentrate damage narrowly. Second, provincial-level measures that go beyond tariffs entirely, the Canada-U.S. trade tracking site run by the Canadian Federation of Independent Business documents that Nova Scotia doubled tolls on the Cobequid Pass for commercial vehicles from the United States, that Ontario's Provincial Liquor Authority pulled all American alcohol from its shelves and ordering catalogs, that the Northwest Territories halted its Liquor and Cannabis Commission's purchases of American goods outright, and that Ontario's government canceled a $100 million contract with Elon Musk's Starlink satellite service. Third, and arguably most powerful of all, is the third layer that no government actually had to design, the grassroots consumer boycott. Polling cited in Wikipedia's sourced overview of the boycott found that 91% of Canadians said they wanted their country to rely less on the United States going forward, a figure researchers described as reflecting a genuinely unprecedented shift in public attitude, not a passing reaction to a single news cycle. It's that third layer, millions of individual Canadians choosing, refrigerator by refrigerator and liquor cabinet by liquor cabinet, not to buy American, that appears to be doing the most durable damage to specific American industries. Precisely because it isn't a government policy that can be negotiated away in a single meeting between two trade representatives. A tariff can be lifted with a signature. A generation of Quebec bartenders who've decided they simply prefer Lot 40 to Sazerac is a much harder thing to reverse. So where does that leave the actual current state of negotiations? As of this week, according to NPR's reporting, U.S. Trade Representative Jameson Greer told Fox News plainly, "We don't have new talks planned with the Canadians. We're moving forward with measures that respond to the Canadian retaliation." Greer also drew a comparison that's worth noting for context. He pointed out that of all the countries affected by Trump's broader trade agenda, only two have chosen to retaliate directly against the United States, the People's Republic of China and Canada. That's a genuinely unusual position for America's closest geographic ally, and for most of the post-war era, one of its most reliable trading partners to find itself in. There's also a longer-term financial question hanging over all of this that gets less attention than the daily tariff headlines, but may matter more. Alfredo Carrillo Obregon, a policy analyst at the Libertarian Cato Institute, told Newsweek that the deeper risk isn't just this specific round of tariffs, it's the uncertainty they create around the USMCA agreement itself, which, as of this dispute, remains in effect for another 10 years, but faces a scheduled review process. Now, this is the largest downside of this dispute and any further escalation, Obregon said, as businesses that rely on an integrated North America may be hesitant to make long-term investments without the security that the agreement will be extended for a longer period. In plain terms, it isn't just this month's tariffs that scare a factory owner in Michigan or Ontario. It's not knowing whether the entire framework that has governed North American trade for 3 decades will still exist in its current form 5 years from now. That uncertainty, Obregon's comment suggests, is arguably a bigger drag on investment than any single tariff rate. Automakers sit squarely inside that uncertainty. The threatened doubling of tariffs on Canadian-made cars, trucks, and auto parts to 50%, set to take effect January 1st, 2027, if nothing changes, lands directly on an industry that has spent 30 years building supply chains that cross the Canada-U.S. border multiple times before a single vehicle is finished. An engine block might cross into Canada for machining, come back into Michigan for assembly, and cross again for a transmission component, all before the car ever reaches a dealership. Tariffs applied at 50% on each of those crossings don't just raise the price of a finished Canadian car, they compound, potentially, at every single stage of a production process that was specifically designed around the assumption of a tariff-free border. Steel is caught in the same trap. The CBC's own visual reporting on this story featured drone footage of the ArcelorMittal Dofasco steel plant in Hamilton, Ontario, a facility whose entire business model depends on selling into the American market that its own government's retaliation is now, indirectly, making more expensive to access from the other direction as well. Let's return then to the core claim in the headline of this story, that U.S. businesses are turning on Trump and that Canada's strategy is starting to work. Based on everything documented above, both halves of that claim hold up with appropriate caveats. On the first half, American businesses turning against the administration's approach, the evidence is not speculative. It is on the record, in the business's own words. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce, an organization with deep and long-standing Republican ties, has publicly and repeatedly criticized this specific tariff policy, released state-by-state damage estimates, and warned of risk to millions of American jobs. The Business Roundtable, representing the CEOs of many of the largest companies in the country, has called directly for the tariffs to be removed. A sitting Republican senator in a competitive swing state has called the policy a mistake to reporters, on the record, by name. Kentucky bourbon makers, one of them a historic black-owned small business, have lost real, quantifiable deals. A major, iconic American distillery has halted production at its flagship facility. Those are not manufactured talking points. Those are named organizations and named executives, on the record, saying the policy is hurting them. On the second half of the claim, that Canada's strategy is working, the honest answer requires more nuance than a headline allows. It depends heavily on how you define winning. If the goal was to inflict enough economic and political pain on the American side to generate visible cracks in Washington's own coalition, cracks among Republican business allies, cracks among Republican senators, measurable damage to specific American industries and specific American small businesses, then yes, by the reporting laid out here, that is demonstrably happening. If the goal, on the other hand, was to force the Trump administration back to the negotiating table on more favorable terms, that outcome has not yet arrived. As of this week, according to Greer's own statement to Fox News, there are no new talks scheduled. The tariffs on both sides remain in place, with the Canadian retaliatory measures still 10 days from taking full effect, as of this recording, and Trump's threat to double auto tariffs come January still very much on the table, rather than withdrawn. It's also important to be honest about the costs sitting on the Canadian side of this same ledger, because a story that only reports American pain would be incomplete and, frankly, misleading. Candice Lang's own warning that Canadians will see customers, investment, and small businesses disappear comes from the head of Canada's own largest business lobbying group, not from an American source with an interest in downplaying Canadian resolve. Small Canadian exporters, by her own account, are looking at payroll and asking what they can still afford. This is a trade war with real casualties in both countries, not a clean victory for either side. There are a few things in this story that remain genuinely unverified or contested, and it's worth naming them plainly rather than glossing over them. The Chamber of Commerce's figure of 13 million American jobs tied to USMCA trade is the Chamber's own advocacy estimate, not an independently audited government statistic, even though it has been repeated across multiple outlets including NBC News. The various boycott percentage figures, the 85% drop in spirits exports, the 91% drop in wine exports, the 69% jump in Quebec's domestic spirit sales, all come from industry trade associations and single company reports, which are credible and consistently sourced across multiple independent news organizations, but which are not the same as a single unified national trade data set. And Trump's framing of the U.S.-Canada trade relationship as one where America is being ripped off, while a real and repeated claim from the president himself is disputed by trade economists who point out that the headline trade imbalance is driven overwhelmingly by U.S. oil purchases from Canada, a transaction that benefits American consumers and refiners directly, not a one-sided loss. To summarize where things stood as of this week, 50% American tariffs on Canadian goods, imposed under a Depression-era law never previously used, went into effect on August 22nd. Canada's matching retaliatory tariffs on more than 700 products are set to take effect September 8th. Trump has threatened to double car and steel tariffs again in January. No new negotiations are currently scheduled, according to America's own trade representative. And in the middle of all of that, some of the most powerful, historically Republican-aligned business organizations in the United States, joined by at least one sitting Republican senator in a competitive race, are on the public record saying the president's own trade policy is hurting the country he's trying to protect. What happens next likely depends on which pressure wins out first, the political pressure building inside Trump's own party from business allies and swing state Republicans nervous about the 2026 midterms, or the trade representatives' stated determination to keep pushing forward with no talks currently planned. Both are real, documented forces pulling in opposite directions, and as of this recording, neither has clearly won. It also helps to understand where this fight actually started, because the roots of it go back further than this August collapse in Washington. The dairy dispute Trump cites so often is a useful example of how a real grievance can be repeated. So often it starts to sound bigger than the underlying numbers support. Trump has pointed to Canada's tariffs on U.S. dairy products, which in some categories run into the triple digits once import quotas are exceeded, as a symbol of what he calls an unfair playing field. But reporting from press outlets covering earlier rounds of the same dispute noted that dairy accounts for only a small fraction of overall Canada-U.S. trade. roughly 0.1% by some estimates cited in that reporting, even though it dominates the political rhetoric around the relationship. That doesn't mean the grievance is invented. Canada's supply management system for dairy is real, and American dairy farmers in border states have genuine complaints about limited market access. But the size of the political noise around dairy is out of proportion to its share of the actual trade relationship, and that gap between rhetoric and dollar value is worth keeping in mind whenever the dispute is framed in simple terms. The steel and aluminum fight has a longer history, too, and it's useful context for understanding why this year's Section 338 tariffs landed as hard as they did. Trump's 25% tariffs on foreign steel and aluminum, including from Canada, were not new in 2026. They trace back to an earlier executive order, and Canadian business advocacy groups pushed back on them from the start. Candice Lang, the same Canadian Chamber of Commerce leader quoted earlier, called that original move wrong on so many levels when it was first announced, while Giles Gerson, president of the Toronto Region Board of Trade, said at the time that immediate action was needed to shore up our economy and Canada's economic sovereignty. That history matters because it shows this year's escalation wasn't a first strike out of nowhere. It was the latest round in a fight that Canadian industry groups had already been sounding alarms about for well over a year. There's also a precedent from Trump's first term worth remembering, because it shows this pattern of Chamber of Commerce pushback isn't unique to 2026. Back in 2018, during an earlier round of steel and aluminum tariffs, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce also broke publicly with the White House, releasing a state-by-state report on the potential damage from Canadian retaliation, at a time when Canada had imposed tariffs on $12.6 billion of American goods, including, notably, Kraft Heinz ketchup and a long list of other U.S. consumer products. The National Post, reporting on that 2018 episode, described it as the Chamber denouncing Trump's handling of global trade disputes, even though the Chamber has traditionally been one of the Republican Party's closest institutional allies. In other words, what's happening now in 2026 is not the first time this exact institution has broken ranks over this exact issue with this exact trading partner. It's a repeat of a pattern, which suggests the current friction between Trump's trade policy and mainstream American business isn't a one-off reaction to a single bad news cycle, but a recurring structural tension every time tariffs on Canada escalate sharply. The political rhetoric surrounding annexation deserves its own mention too, because multiple outlets, including the Wikipedia aggregated timeline of the Canadian boycott and CBC's own year-in-review reporting, identify Trump's repeated suggestion that Canada become the 51st American state as one of the two primary triggers of the entire consumer boycott movement, alongside the tariffs themselves. That combination, economic pressure paired with rhetoric many Canadians experienced as a genuine threat to their national sovereignty, appears to be part of why the boycott took on the scale and staying power that it did. A tariff dispute alone might have produced grumbling. Tariffs combined with talk of statehood produced, according to the polling cited earlier, a described sense of near-unanimous public engagement, with 90% of Canadians telling pollsters in February 2025 that they were following the trade dispute closely, among the highest levels of sustained public attention to any single news story tracked by that polling in years. For the automakers and steelmakers caught in the middle of all this, the timeline ahead is now fairly concrete, and it's worth laying it out plainly. September 8th, 2026 is when Canada's retaliatory tariffs on more than 700 American product categories take full effect. January 1st, 2027 is when Trump's threatened doubling of tariffs on Canadian cars, trucks, auto parts, and steel to 50% is set to begin, unless something changes before then. Between now and those two dates sits whatever window remains for a renegotiated deal, a window that, as of this week, both sides describe as effectively closed, with America's own trade representative saying flatly that no new talks are currently planned. Whether that window reopens before either deadline arrives is, at this point, the single biggest open question hanging over this entire dispute. So here's the question worth sitting with. When a country's own traditional business allies, the Chamber of Commerce, the Business Roundtable, Republican senators in swing states, start publicly breaking from a trade policy, at what point does that pressure actually change the policy itself, rather than just generating headlines about internal dissent? Is this the beginning of a real reversal in Washington's approach to Canada, or is it simply the noise that accompanies any prolonged trade fight, with both governments ultimately willing to absorb the political cost? I'd genuinely like to know what you think, particularly if you're watching this from inside one of the industries named here, bourbon, autos, steel, or tourism, because the people actually living this dispute usually understand it better than any script written from the outside ever could. If you want the next update on this story as new tariff deadlines hit, and as we see whether Washington and Ottawa actually get back to the table, it's worth staying subscribed. This is exactly the kind of fast-moving story where the facts on the ground can shift within days. and we'll keep tracking it with the same source-by-source approach we've used here. If you found the breakdown of who's actually being hurt and who's actually benefiting useful in cutting through the noise on this story, subscribing helps make sure you don't miss the next chapter when it happens. Because based on the timeline here, September 8th is coming fast, and January 1st isn't far behind it. And if you'd rather not wait for the algorithm to decide when you see it, hitting subscribe now is the simplest way to make sure this channel's coverage of the next move in this trade war lands directly in front of you. Thanks for watching, and we'll be back with the next development as soon as it happens.